At 14:34 on Sunday, September 15, 1940, 18,000 feet above the Thames Estuary, Sergeant Pilot Jamie Mercer, age 24, lifts the nose of his Supermarine Spitfire Mk I and watches the sky ahead turn black with aircraft. He is in No. 603 Squadron, flying out of RAF Hornchurch in No. 11 Group, the part of Fighter Command that has been taking the hardest hits since July. On his wrist, a cheap watch ticks loud inside a tight glove. On his oxygen mask, the rubber strap bites into his cheeks. His cockpit smells of cordite from the last scramble and hot glycol from a system that never quite stops sweating. At 14:34, the radio is not calm. It is clipped, fast, overloaded. A controller's voice cuts through the static. Bandits. Multiple plots. Large formation. Angels 1-8. Heading west. Mercer shifts his eyes from the instruments to the horizon. He sees them, tiny points at first, then a growing wall, German bombers in tight boxes, escorted fighters above and to the side. It is not a rumor today. It is not a small raid probing the coast. This is the main effort. In his Spitfire's wings sit 8.303 Browning machine guns, rifle-caliber weapons fed by long belts. Each gun carries roughly 300 rounds, enough for seconds, not minutes, of continuous fire. It is a design choice that sounds generous on paper, until a pilot realizes that 8 guns firing together can burn through ammunition in the time it takes to count to 15. Mercer knows that number without thinking. He has lived it. At 14:36, he pushes the throttle forward and the Rolls-Royce Merlin answers with a hard, rising note. The Spitfire shudders, then steadies as it gains speed. The air at this altitude is thin and cold. The canopy edges frost in places where the defroster can't reach. Somewhere below, London is already under warning. At 14:38, he checks left. 2 Spitfires hold station, close enough that he can see the dark goggles of the nearest pilot. They fly with no wasted movement, conserving energy for a fight that will be decided in seconds, angles, speed, and surprise. At 14:40, the formation in front resolves into shapes. The bombers are Dornier Do 17s, narrow-bodied, twin-engine aircraft with a reputation that RAF pilots have already named the Flying Pencil. They don't look like pencils now. They look like a moving barricade of aluminum and glass, carrying bombs toward the city. Above them, higher, faster, are the escorts. Bf 109s, the sharp-winged fighters that can climb and dive with brutal efficiency. They are waiting for the RAF to commit, then punish any aircraft that lingers too long behind a bomber. At 14:41, Mercer's squadron leader gives the order. It is short and final. Red section, attack bombers. Blue section, cover high. Mercer is red section. That means he goes in. He pushes his Spitfire into a shallow dive to build speed, the airframe tightening as the needle passes 300 miles per hour. He does not aim for the escorts. If he chases fighters, the bombers reach London unbroken. The doctrine is simple. Break the bomber formation, force them to jettison, scatter them, delay them, kill crews, destroy aircraft. The escorts can come later, if there's a later. At 14:42, the first tracers are already in the sky. White pinpricks streak past as defensive gunners begin firing early, hoping to make the RAF flinch. The Do 17's gunners work with 7.92 mm machine guns, limited arcs, and cramped stations behind plexiglass. They are not helpless, but their greatest weapon is the bomber formation itself, crossing fields of fire, overlapping bursts, confusion. Mercer picks a single Dornier near the edge of the box. He closes to 300 yards. He waits. He has been taught not to fire too early, not to waste rounds on long-range hope. At 250 yards, he fires. 8 Brownings hammer at once. The Spitfire vibrates as if it is being struck from within. Tracer flickers out ahead and walks toward the Dornier's right engine. He holds the burst for 2 seconds, then stops. 2 seconds is discipline. 2 seconds is survival. He breaks down and away, rolling right to avoid the bomber's rear guns and to avoid becoming an easy target for the escorts above. The sky flashes with stray fire. Pieces of metal, small, bright, spin away from the Dornier's wing root. At 1443, he climbs back up for a second pass. His hands are steady, but his mouth is dry. He doesn't talk. Most pilots don't. Radio time is precious, and anything that sounds like fear can spread. At 1444, he sees a Bf 109 drop through the formation like a hawk. The German fighter doesn't chase him yet. It shadows, waiting for Mercer to commit again, waiting for Mercer to bleed speed behind a bomber. Mercer knows the trap. He changes his attack angle. Instead of coming in from behind, he approaches from the side front, aiming for a head-on or quartering pass. Short exposure, high closure rate. It is violent and brief. If he misjudges by a fraction, he collides. If he hesitates, he dies. At 1445, he comes in again. The Dornier's glass nose fills his reflector sight. He fires another 2-second burst. This time, rounds stitch across the cockpit area and the left engine nacelle. He sees a puff of smoke, thin, gray, then nothing. No fire. No dramatic explosion. Just damage. Real damage looks like that. Subtle, incomplete, uncertain. He breaks away again, hard left, and feels the Spitfire strain. The aircraft is light and responsive, but there is no armor around him that matters. A single lucky hit can end everything. At 1446, the bomber formation begins to fragment under repeated attacks across the sky. Some Dorniers turn back toward the coast. Others tighten up, trying to keep mutual support. A few push on, stubborn and straight, as if straight flight alone can force the outcome. The radio erupts with quick reports. One bomber streaming. 109's diving, break. Watch your tail, watch your tail. Mercer checks his mirrors. He sees a Bf 109 pass behind him, too fast to shoot, too close to ignore. The German pilot is hunting, not saving bombers. The escort knows that if he kills the RAF fighters, the bombers become irrelevant. At 1447, Mercer's ammunition counter, crude, more feel than instrument, has already shifted in his mind. He knows how many bursts he has fired. He knows how quickly the guns eat belts. The Spitfire gives no warning light for nearly empty. There is only the harsh truth when the guns click on air. At 1448, he commits to a third pass, and then a fourth. He does not linger. He darts in, fires, and breaks away, using the Spitfire's acceleration and roll rate to survive. The bursts are short. The distances are tight. The closure speeds are extreme, two aircraft approaching each other at a combined speed near 500 miles per hour. He is doing what the system demands: intercept, disrupt, repeat. By 1452, the fight has drifted south and west. London is now under the formation's projected path. Mercer sees bombers below him, a few slipping through gaps, no longer in neat boxes, now in loose, desperate groups. One Dornier, separated and slightly lower, heads alone toward the city center. Mercer watches it and understands what it means. A single bomber can still kill civilians. A single bomber can still hit a rail station, a power substation, a crowded street. At 1453, Mercer pushes down after it. His Spitfire drops like a stone, the airspeed building. He has altitude. He has position. But he does not have time. As he lines up, he squeezes the trigger for a test burst. The guns answer with a shorter rattle than before. Not the full, confident roar. He checks the feel of the trigger. He checks the rhythm. He knows it now, in his bones. He is almost out. At 1454, he closes to 200 yards behind the lone Dornier. The bomber's tail gun starts firing, short bursts, searching. Mercer's Spitfire shudders as bullets snap past. He ignores it. He moves closer, tighter, inside the bomber's defensive pattern, where the gunner has less time to track. Mercer presses the trigger again. The Brownings hammer, briefly. Then the sound changes. The vibration fades. The firing becomes intermittent, ragged. He has burned down to what feels like nothing. At 14:55, with London ahead and the bomber still flying, Mercer does not pull away. He does not break off and hope someone else finishes it. He stays on the Dornier's tail and keeps closing, because there is only one fact that matters now. He has perhaps 20 rounds left, and he is still charging. At 14:55, Mercer is inside 150 yards. The Dornier's tailplane fills his sight picture. The bomber's rear gun fires again, short bursts that look scattered but are not random. Every burst is a correction. Every correction is a chance. Mercer is down to the last scraps of ammunition. The earlier bursts were disciplined, 2 seconds, then off. Now there is no discipline left to conserve. Conservation only matters if there is time to use what remains. He squeezes the trigger. A thin rattle. Not 8 guns. Not even close. 1 or 2 guns are still feeding. The others are empty or jammed. Tracer lines forward in a short, broken chain. The rounds strike the Dornier's rear fuselage. A few hit the port engine cowling. A few vanish into nothing. Mercer keeps firing until the guns stop entirely. The sound dies. The cockpit becomes suddenly quiet except for the Merlin, the wind, and the hiss of oxygen. The trigger goes slack under his finger, useless. At 14:56, the Dornier is still flying. Mercer is not supposed to be here. A pilot without ammunition is meant to disengage. Go home. Land. Rearm. Return. That's the arithmetic of survival. But survival is not the only arithmetic. Mercer has watched London burn for weeks. He has watched columns of smoke rise after raids that were only a few bombers. He has heard the casualty numbers. He has read the squadron notice board with names crossed out. He will not let a lone bomber stroll into the city because he followed procedure. At 14:56, he shoves the throttle to the gate and closes again. The Spitfire's nose creeps closer to the Dornier's tail. He is now inside 100 yards. This is the dead zone for a rear gun. The Dornier's gunner cannot elevate far enough to depress onto a fighter directly beneath and behind in a steep pursuit. But the gunner can still fire. And the bomber's pilots can still maneuver. Mercer's problem is simpler and worse. He has no bullets. He flicks his eyes across the cockpit. Mixture. Prop pitch. Oil pressure. Coolant temperature. The Merlin is still healthy. The Spitfire is still fast. That is what he has left, speed and position. He has an idea that is not clever. It is not heroic. It is brutal practicality. He will force the bomber off its line. At 14:57, Mercer slides slightly left, out of the direct tail position, and then eases back in. He wants the Dornier's pilot to see him. He wants the crew to feel the threat. Not a hidden attacker. A visible one. The Dornier begins a shallow turn. The bomber's wings tilt. The crew is trying to shake him, to make him overshoot, to bring the rear gun to bear. It's standard evasion, gentle enough to keep the formation's pace and direction, but this bomber is alone now. It can turn harder. Mercer turns with it. The Spitfire's roll rate is quick, the response immediate. He matches the bank angle, keeps the range tight. At 14:58, a Bf 109 slices past at higher altitude. Mercer sees it and feels his stomach tighten. The escort has noticed him lingering behind a bomber. This is exactly what the German fighter pilot wants. An RAF pilot slow, committed, distracted. Mercer does not look away for long. If he loses the bomber now, it disappears into the haze over the city. He stays on. At 14:58, the 109 drops a little lower, not diving fully. The pilot is evaluating. A simple question is being answered in that German cockpit. Is this RAF pilot out of ammunition? Is he desperate? Is he bait? Mercer cannot answer in words. The only language available is movement. He increases closure again. The Dornier's tail grows large. He is inside 70 yards. This is where mistakes turn fatal. At these speeds, 70 yards disappears in moments. A bomber that turns slightly can collide with a fighter that is too close. A fighter that pulls up too late can clip a tailplane. Mercer is betting the Dornier crew will not risk a collision. Bomber pilots are trained to preserve the aircraft and the bombs. A collision is a total loss. He slides closer still, 60 yards, and holds. The Dornier's pilot reacts. The bomber banks harder. The nose drops slightly. The aircraft begins drifting away from London's direct line. Mercer follows the turn, not breaking away, not giving the bomber space to stabilize. He is using the Spitfire itself as a weapon, an unspoken threat of impact. At 14:59, the Dornier's rear gun fires again, but the angle is poor. The rounds trail below Mercer's fuselage. A few snap past the canopy. Mercer does not flinch. Flinching moves the stick. Moving the stick wrong at this range kills him. He keeps the aircraft steady. At 1500 hours, the Dornier continues turning. It is now heading south-southeast, away from the most direct approach. This is not a clean victory. It is not a kill. But it is a disruption, and disruption is the currency of fighter command. Mercer is not satisfied. A bomber that turns away can still turn back. He has to keep pressure on it until it commits. The Spitfire's nose is now slightly above the Dornier's tail. Mercer edges higher, bringing himself into a position where the bomber's dorsal gunner, if present, might have a shot. But the Dornier is cramped. Its defensive arcs are limited. The RAF has learned that the Do-17 is most dangerous when attackers stay at mid-range behind it. Close in and the geometry collapses. At 15:01, Mercer moves to the bomber's right side, almost abreast of the tail, where the crew can see his aircraft clearly through side windows. He holds there for a second. He wants them to understand. He is still there, still aggressive, still willing to come closer. The Dornier's turn tightens again. The bomber loses altitude, down to 14,000 feet, and its speed bleeds. Mercer senses panic in the movement, the imperfect coordination of a crew under attack. Above and behind, the Bf 109 finally commits. At 15:01, Mercer sees the German fighter's nose drop. The 109 is beginning a diving attack. Mercer has seconds. He can break away now and save himself. He can drop the bomber and fight the escort. But without ammunition, fighting a 109 is meaningless. It becomes a chase with no teeth. He chooses a third option. He dives. At 15:02, Mercer pushes the Spitfire's nose down, hard, using gravity to accelerate. The Dornier dives too, trying to escape, but it is heavier and less responsive. The 109 dives after Mercer, but now the geometry changes. The German pilot is attacking a fighter in a high-speed dive, not a slow target. The closure rate becomes risky. Firing window shrinks. Mercer is using the only advantage he has left, the Spitfire's ability to dive cleanly and hold together. The airspeed climbs. 350, 380, 400 miles per hour. The controls stiffen. The wind noise rises. At 15:03, Mercer levels slightly, still behind the Dornier, now over the southern approaches to London. He is low enough to see the ground details, roads, fields, flashes of sunlight off rooftops. He is also low enough that any bailout becomes deadly. The Dornier starts to wobble. Not a controlled maneuver. Something is wrong, engine trouble or damage from earlier bursts, or simply a pilot pushing a strained aircraft too hard. Mercer closes once more, 50 yards, and holds the pressure. The bomber's port engine begins to smoke more heavily now, a darker stream. It yaws slightly to the left. Mercer watches and understands. The aircraft is failing. Not exploding, not falling apart, just failing, piece by piece, as machines do. At 15:04, the Dornier banks left, sharper than before. It is not turning back toward London. It is turning away, toward open ground, toward the coast. Mercer stays on it for another 10 seconds to be sure. Then he breaks away. He rolls right, pulls up, and climbs just enough to scan for the 109. The German fighter flashes past, overshooting. The pilot has lost the clean shot in the dive and now has to reposition. Mercer has no ammunition, no allies close, and low altitude. The worst combination. He does the only thing left. He runs. At 15:05, Mercer points his Spitfire toward friendly airspace, keeping low to reduce visibility and to make pursuit harder. The Merlin roars at near full power. The aircraft shakes with speed. The canopy vibrates. Behind him, the sky is still full of combat. Spitfires and Hurricanes slash through bomber streams. Black puffs of flak hang where anti-aircraft guns fire upward. Smoke columns rise from somewhere in the city's direction. Mercer's hands are still steady, but his body is flooded with adrenaline. He has no clear memory of the last 10 minutes except fragments. Tracer, glass, the heavy shape of the Dornier filling his sight, the dead trigger, the decision to keep closing anyway. At 15:08, he crosses over the outskirts and climbs slightly, finally allowing himself to breathe. The radio is alive with more calls, more raids, more plots, more squadrons being scrambled. This was not the only fight today. It was part of a larger battle, an entire day of air combat that will be remembered later as a turning point. But Mercer doesn't know that yet. Right now, he only knows the practical problem waiting at the end of his flight. He must land with empty guns, a hot engine, and the knowledge that he stayed in the fight after the weapons were gone. And he must be ready to do it again. At 15:12, Mercer drops his landing gear over Hornchurch and brings the Spitfire in low, fast, and tight, because even on approach he assumes someone is behind him. The airfield is crowded with aircraft cycling through landings and takeoffs. A ground crewman stands near the runway edge, arms raised, ready to signal. Mercer touches down hard. The tail settles. He keeps the nose straight with his boots, then taxis off the runway at the first exit, engines still roaring. He does not shut down until he is parked, because a running aircraft can move again. A dead one cannot. At 15:14, the Merlin finally cuts. The sudden silence is almost disorienting. The ground crew is on him immediately. One man reaches for the canopy latch. Another checks the wings for holes. An armorer's corporal kneels beside the leading edge and opens the gun bay panels with practiced speed. Mercer climbs out and drops to the grass. His legs feel light, almost detached. He removes his helmet and oxygen mask, then looks back at the aircraft as if checking whether it is real. The armorers pull the empty belts free. They do not count the rounds one by one. They don't have to. They can see the slack. They can see the feed blocks. They can see the brass links and the last few cartridges where they stopped. One of them looks up. Out. Mercer nods once. At 15:16, he walks toward the dispersal hut where the intelligence officer waits with a notebook. Pilots come back in twos and threes, some talking fast, some silent, some shaking as the adrenaline fades. A stretcher is carried across the grass toward the medical point. Mercer doesn't look long enough to identify the face. Inside the hut, a map of southeast England is pinned to the wall. The officer doesn't ask for feelings. He asks for facts. Time of engagement. Mercer answers. 1442 to 1505. Over the estuary. Then south toward the city. Type. Do 17ths. 1 separated. Escort 109s. Results. Mercer pauses. He knows the problem. In air combat, certainty is rare. Smoke is not a kill. A turn away is not a kill. But a disrupted bomber can be the difference between bombs falling on the target and bombs falling into open fields. One bomber forced off course, Mercer says. Port engine smoking. Didn't see it hit the ground. The officer writes it down without judgment. At 15:18, outside, the machine keeps moving. A refueling Bowser pulls up. A hose is connected. Fuel goes in, high-octane aviation gasoline, because the Merlin's performance depends on it. The aircraft is not simply a pilot's weapon, it is an entire chain of labor. Mechanics checking coolant, riggers inspecting control surfaces, armorers feeding belts into ammunition boxes, fitters adjusting the gun harmonization that decides where 8 streams of .303 rounds converge. Mercer watches the rearming process because it tells him how soon he might be airborne again. The Browning guns are simple, reliable in theory, but they can jam from vibration, misfeeds, icing, or damage. The armorers clear the feed chutes, check the charging handles, then thread fresh belts. Each gun's belt is heavy with brass and lead. It is a physical reminder that a fighter's firepower is not unlimited. And it also reminds him of the limitation that pilots rarely say out loud. .303 rounds can struggle against robust aircraft unless fired at close range, placed into engines, fuel lines, or crew compartments. That is why he had pressed inside 200 yards. That is why he had ended up on the bomber's tail with no ammunition left. At 15:22, the squadron dispersal phone rings again. A runner steps out and shouts, "Pilots! Stand by!" Mercer's mouth goes dry. The day is not over. In the operations rooms across No. 11 Group, the doubting system is still working, radar stations on the coast feeding plots to filter rooms, then to group and sector controllers, then to squadron dispersals like this one. It is not magic. It is telephones, tables, women moving markers across maps, and officers making decisions under pressure with incomplete data. But it means one thing for Mercer: he will be called up again before he feels ready. At 15:27, the scramble bell rings. It is not a drill. It never is. Mercer runs back to his Spitfire. The ground crew has already closed the panels. The guns are loaded. The fuel is topped. The aircraft is as ready as it will ever be. He climbs in, straps tight, checks the harness, checks the gun sight, checks the throttle friction. He signals to pull the chocks. The Merlin coughs, then catches. The propeller becomes a translucent disc. The cockpit fills with vibration and the smell of exhaust. At 15:29, Mercer taxis out with the others, forming a loose line. He keeps distance. A collision on the ground would be absurd, and it happens anyway when men are rushed and tired. At 15:31, they take off. The Spitfires climb in a wide spiral, building altitude as quickly as they can without overheating. Below them, Hornchurch shrinks into a patch of green and concrete. Above them, the sky is hazy, stained in places by smoke. On days like this, the air seems crowded even when it isn't. Pilots see shapes and shadows and think they are aircraft. The mind searches for threats because threats have been everywhere. At 15:38, the controller's voice returns. Raid. Large formation. Angels 20. Heading for London. Vector 180. This is the second fight for Mercer today, and it is the same fight in a different position. He looks left and right. He sees the other Spitfires holding formation, small against the sky, but solid. It is not courage in the romantic sense. It is duty, routine, and fear managed into action. At 15:44, they make contact again. Another bomber stream, another escort layer above. The aircraft types are harder to identify at first. Shapes blur at distance. But Mercer soon sees the longer wings and the heavier bodies. This group is Heinkel He 111s, moving in organized lines. The formation is not as tight as the Dorniers he attacked earlier. It looks like a machine under strain, fatigue, losses, the cumulative effect of weeks of fighting. Mercer is not thinking about history. He is thinking about angles, speed, and the brief seconds when his guns can hit. At 15:46, he dives. This time, he does not aim at the cockpit. He aims at the engines, because engines stop bombers faster than any other part. He closes to 250 yards, then 200. He fires a controlled burst. The 8 Brownings hammer again, full strength, full rhythm. The sound in the cockpit is violent and familiar. Rounds walk into the Heinkel's starboard engine area. There is a flash, small, bright, then a smear of smoke. Mercer breaks away instantly, rolling out of the bomber's defensive fire. He does not linger to watch. Linger gets people killed. At 15:47, a Bf 109 dives after him. Mercer sees it too late to avoid the first burst. He hears impacts, sharp thuds, on the fuselage. The Spitfire jolts. A warning light flickers, then steadies. He checks the controls. They still respond. He pushes the Spitfire down and away, using speed rather than turn. The 109 follows, firing in short bursts, but the window is brief and the range opens fast. At 1549, Mercer pulls into a hard climbing turn, trying to rejoin his section and avoid being isolated. He sees another Spitfire cross his path, then another. The sky is a mess of intersecting fights, small, separate duels and sudden attacks that begin and end in seconds. Below, bombers are dropping through gaps and turning away. Some are still pushing on. Mercer finds another target, and he 111 lagging behind, flying lower and slower than the rest. He lines up again. He fires again. The rounds strike the wing root. The bomber wobbles. For a moment, Mercer sees a parachute, one, then a second, small figures dropping away into the air. He does not cheer. He does not speak. He keeps flying, because this is not over and the sky punishes distraction. At 1555, the bomber stream begins to fracture more noticeably. The fight is shifting. The formations are losing cohesion. Some aircraft turn back toward the coast. Others scatter into smaller groups. Mercer's fuel is lower now. His adrenaline is gone, replaced by a heavy focus that feels like exhaustion. His mouth tastes metallic. His hands feel stiff around the stick. He checks the time again. 1556. He realizes he has been fighting for more than an hour across 2 engagements with barely a pause between. And still the radio is alive with more plots, more calls, more aircraft being vectored into the air. Mercer doesn't know how history will name this day. He doesn't know what newspapers will print tomorrow. He knows only what his squadron knows right now. The Luftwaffe is trying to break Fighter Command, and Fighter Command is still getting airborne. At 1558, Mercer turns back toward Hornchurch with his section, because fuel and ammunition are finite, and because surviving to fight again is part of the mission. But the memory of the first engagement, the dead trigger, the empty guns, the decision to keep closing anyway, does not leave him. It sits in his chest like weight. And it is changing the way he thinks about combat, about equipment, and about what a pilot does when the machine runs out of answers. At 1606, Mercer's Spitfire drops onto final approach again. Hornchurch is still operating under pressure, aircraft landing with battle damage, others taking off with barely enough time to brief. When Mercer touches down, the ground crew is already watching for leaks, smoke, and holes. He taxis in and shuts down at 1609. His hands shake slightly when he unclips the harness. Not fear, after effects. The body dumping what it held back while it was busy keeping him alive. On the wing root, an armorer's corporal points to a fresh line of holes along the fuselage skin. They are small, clean, and close together, 7.92 mm strikes, likely from the last 109 that pressed him in the second engagement. One round has chewed a shallow groove near the cockpit, close enough that Mercer doesn't need anyone to explain what it means. At 1612, the intelligence officer debriefs him again. Same questions. Same need for precision. Mercer gives times, headings, aircraft types, and what he saw. He reports the empty gun engagement from earlier, not as a story, but as a tactical fact, a bomber diverted under pressure when he could no longer fire. The officer raises an eyebrow. "You stayed on him?" Mercer answers without drama. "Yes." "Close pursuit. Forced him off the line." The officer writes it down. The moment becomes a line on paper, one of hundreds that day, feeding a broader picture of what is happening over England. Outside the hut, the squadron commander catches Mercer as he walks back toward the dispersal. "Sergeant," he says, "you're alive." Mercer nods. "It isn't a joke. It's a tally." The commander's tone stays flat. "Next time your guns go quiet, you break." "Understood." Mercer hesitates just long enough to make it clear he heard the order and also remembers why he ignored it. "Understood, sir," he says. But the commander's eyes linger on him, weighing the same thing every leader in fighter command weighs: aggression wins fights, and aggression kills pilots. The line between the two is thin and personal. By 1830, the pace finally slows. There are still scattered raids, still alerts, but the massed daylight streams have diminished. Pilots sit on benches or on the grass, drinking tea they can't taste. Ground crewmen move like machines, refueling, patching, rearming, because the machine has to keep moving. That night, the news in the mess is cautious, not triumphant. No one is claiming a final victory. But the mood is different than it was in August. The raids were met. The squadrons rose. The system held. And Mercer knows, privately, that what he did at 1455, pressing in with empty guns, was not bravery in the clean sense. It was a moment where equipment limits collided with mission requirements. That tension stays with him. On September 16, 1940 at 7:10, Mercer sits with an armorer at the gun bays. He doesn't do it to play mechanic. He does it because he wants to understand the failure points that matter in the air. The corporal shows him the feed, the ammunition boxes, the belt run, the way vibration can shake links, the way cold and oil can change the feel. He explains stoppages. He explains how long it takes to clear a jam in flight, too long when a bomber is already over the target. Mercer asks one question again and again in different ways: how to get more decisive effect in less time. The corporal's answer is blunt: get closer, aim for engines, don't waste bursts, and accept that .303 is not a cannon. Mercer has felt that truth in combat. On paper, 8 guns look overwhelming. In the air, against a bomber that can absorb punishment, they often require perfect placement and repeated passes, each pass increasing exposure to gunners and escorts. That week, he begins changing his own habits. He sets his gun convergence tighter, favoring short-range engagements where .303 can do real damage. He limits bursts to 1 second unless he has an engine fill the sight. He drills head-on attacks on bombers in training flights, high closure, minimal time in defensive arcs. He pays attention to sunlight and cloud, because surprise is the only way to extend the firing window without extending exposure. Those are personal choices at first. But Fighter Command is learning the same lessons across dozens of squadrons. By March 1941, Mercer is no longer the youngest man in the hut. He has survived long enough that newer pilots look at him the way he once looked at veterans, waiting for a trick, a secret, a way to last. He is promoted to flight sergeant after a winter of constant sorties and a handful of verified claims: damaged aircraft seen to crash, bombers confirmed by multiple witnesses. His logbook becomes tight with ink. He also sees the air war shifting. The Spitfire evolves. New marks arrive with more power, more weight, and, crucially, new armament options. Fighter Command is moving toward 20mm cannon as the need for heavier punch becomes unavoidable. More bombers. Tougher airframes. Less time to fire. Mercer doesn't become an engineer, but he becomes the kind of pilot commanders use as a reference point. A man who can explain, in plain language, why the gun solution matters. In the summer of 1941, he is pulled off frontline rotations for a period and sent to a training unit as an instructor. Temporary, until losses ease, which is how the RAF phrases everything it can't guarantee. He hates it at first. Instruction feels like watching the war through glass. Then he watches a new pilot waste half his ammunition firing too early, too far, too long. Mercer stops the debrief and makes it practical. He puts a stopwatch on the table. "Count to 12, he tells the pilot. "That's your entire ammunition supply if you hold the trigger down. So you don't hold it down." He teaches them to think in seconds, in angles, in closures. And he tells them, without embellishment, what happened at 1455 on September 15th, not as a legend, but as a warning: if you let the fight drag, you will run out. If you run out, you will have only your aircraft's position and your judgment left. The lesson lands because it is mechanical, not moral. In 1942 and 1943, Mercer returns to operations in intervals, coastal patrols, sweeps over occupied France, escort work where the enemy is as likely to be fighters as bombers. The war expands. The threat changes. The big daylight raids of 1940 are not the same as the long, grinding air fighting that follows. He is commissioned, pilot officer, not because he seeks rank, but because experienced pilots are needed to lead. Leadership is now another job layered on top of flying, keeping sections together, making decisions in seconds, bringing men home. He carries the same memory forward, the moment a weapon runs dry and a mission is still unfinished. It makes him cautious in one way and aggressive in another. He becomes cautious about waste of ammunition, waste of altitude, waste of energy. And he becomes aggressive about initiative, getting the first shot, forcing the first break, making the enemy react. Those are the habits that keep him alive long enough to see the end. On May 8, 1945 at 10 o'clock, Mercer stands in uniform in a crowded hall and listens to the war in Europe being declared over. Around him are men who look older than their years. Some are missing friends they can't name without going quiet. Mercer leaves the RAF not immediately, but in stages, like most of them do. Demobilization is paperwork, interviews, and the slow unhooking of a life built around alarms and fuel and orders. He goes into civilian work connected to aviation, maintenance management first, then training and safety. He does not chase publicity. He does not write a grand memoir. But he does something that matters just as much. He speaks when asked, and he speaks precisely. Years later, when a museum curator or a local historian interviews him about that day, Mercer always corrects the framing. It wasn't one pilot versus 200 bombers. It was a system, radar plots, controllers, ground crews, squadrons, holding together long enough for individual pilots to make individual choices. And yes, there was a moment when his Spitfire's guns went quiet and he stayed in the fight anyway. Not because it was romantic. Because a bomber was still pointed at London. By the time Mercer is an old man, visitors walk through hangars and see the artifacts. The Spitfire's sleek wing, the gun bay panels, the belts of .303 rounds, the later cannon installations that replaced them. Guides explain, in simple terms, why armament changed, why 8 rifle-caliber guns gave way to heavier cannon, why firing time and destructive effect mattered as much as speed and climb. Mercer's story survives in fragments, a debrief note, a logbook entry, a training anecdote repeated by men who learn from him. The legacy is not a statue. It is doctrine made practical. It is pilots taught to measure their fire in seconds, to understand convergence, to break formations instead of chasing glory, and to respect the moment when the trigger does nothing, because that moment arrives faster than anyone expects. And it is the reminder, stamped into Fighter Command's memory of September 15, 1940, that sometimes the difference between bombs falling on a city and bombs falling wide is not a miracle. It is a pilot who refuses to disengage when the machine runs out of answers.